It's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down in the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody see it, nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all the time.
All right, Gio, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Great, man. Great. What an intro. I wish I had that high production value. Maybe I'll pay Micah Paul or somebody to do an intro like that for me. But
my audio guy
good.
has actually, he did work for me and a couple other people as well. Great work. And there's another one soon in the pipe. I'm going to be doing another intro, some more rebranding stuff. And the new intro is even better. Similar theme, but we doubled down. It turns out the subgenre of dark synth boomhauer, there aren't exactly a lot of options there.
Well, dude,
it's
God.
Great to have you back on. You and I have been talking a decent amount over the last month or so, and as yet unreleased episodes on your channel. But you approached me about doing a retrospective on Sky King. Mm-hmm. So obviously I'm terminally online enough to know who that is, but some of my audience might not be. So do you want to just discuss the kind of broad strokes of that and we can jump into it from there?
Sure. Well, I want to discuss him and Aaron Bushnell as two very interesting case studies. But Sky King Rich Russell was was in Seattle. Yeah, it was in Seattle. He was a loading dock operator. But then he learned, I don't know how he did this. He learned how the basics of flying a plane on his own just by reading on the internet. And he commandeered, I mean, let's not beat around the bush. He stole an airplane. And there was this very interesting moment where air traffic control was talking to him. And it was essentially an act of, well, for YouTube OPSEC, he sunsetted himself by commandeering a plane, stealing a plane, doing a barrel roll, wishing to see, I believe it was orcas on the sea floor near where he was. And it was sort of like, he even said this when they were talking to him, that he didn't wish to harm anybody. You know, it wasn't like many other plane hijackings from around the 60s, 70s up until, well, you know, the big one. We all know the big one, right?
As a prominent Minnesota representative said, some people did some things.
Some people did something. Yeah. Well, that was like what Thomas was saying in the 70s with a lot of radical, politically motivated terrorist groups on the left and some on the right, but mostly on the left. There were plane hijackings going on all the time, especially in Europe. So, yeah, he commandeered this plane. He basically became a weird form of folk hero for a lot of, in particularly disaffected young, largely white men, because he even said this, like, I'm just a white guy. Because they asked him, like, why don't you go to flight school and get a job? And he said, well, I'm just a white guy, it's diversity hire. And this was 2018. This was like peak of the 2010s. And I think that the world was, the world was actually very different back then. And there was one line I remember. There was a great article in the American Sun called Last Flight of the White Man. But I remember that at the time, my former editor for Thermidor magazine, whose name I shouldn't mention because it's controversial and he got into a lot of hot water, he said that it was the Sky King thing. Rich Russell was the first time that the right wing online wasn't like explicitly worshiping someone who was a legitimate terrorist or a dictator in the 20th century or something like that. So I think that there was a lot of debate even nowadays at this sort of, I believe, 5th anniversary or 5th anniversary of his passing. There was always this debate whether Rich Russell was worthy of being lionized as someone who didn't choose to commit an act of violent terrorism with a plane, but rather chose to sort of what a lot of people described at the time, was going out on sort of like a last high moment, right? Kind of like, and I know this is probably going to sound kind of, grandiose or cringe or whatever for some people, but it's sort of like in Zarathustra, where, the very first book of Zarathustra, where you have the tightrope walker. The attempt to do something great is why Zarathustra lionizes this tightrope walker at this carnival. And in a way, you could sort of see a similarity there in terms of choosing, in the depth of despair, a final moment of elation and doing something that is out of the norm, that sort of breaks routine, mundane life. And there was actually an interview with someone that worked with Rich Russell, an article, I believe in the Seattle Times or something like that. It was very well written, by the way, that said, I worked with Rich Russell. He was a great guy. I understood why he did it. Because if you work that type of work, you become sort of like an effaced, monotonous machine-like operation of life. And of course, there are a lot of, not to sort of, how shall I say it? Not to totally glaze him. I hate that term, glaze, but let's say not to totally mythologize him. He did have a wife and he did have a kid. And so I think that there was obviously a mental illness element going on. But I think that the debate over Psy King recently, within the last few years, has sort of taken on a new avenue of discourse because of the Aaron Bushnell thing. And I think that there are two very interesting case studies there. But but go ahead, Bert. I've been talking through a little bit. So
so a couple things there. Obviously, we take a very courageous moral stance at the Jay Burden Show that killing yourself is not good. You shouldn't do it. But nonetheless, right, it is worth discussing because, and this sounds almost stupid to say, but as a meme, he has lived on.
Yes.
Right? Like Keep Flying Sky King, right? He's sort of been memorialized. And it's an interesting sort of reaction to nihilism, right? A reaction to, the state where, there is no transcendent value and my life is pointless. So in that bounded rationality, right, accepting that premise, what do you do? Because, sadly, the response of, many men who kill themselves, either directly or indirectly, is effectively just to retreat, right? Yeah. Pull your car into the garage, or, take some pills, or, Kurt Cobain yourself all over the ceiling.
Tighten the noose. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And this is different than that, right? There's a certain element to this, which is directionally the same, right? As a voluntary ending of one's own life. But that moment, or that aspect you spoke about, right, of the going out on a high note, is something different, and what almost makes it more tragic, right? There's sort of a grasping for something transcendent and meaningful, right? A recognition of I could have done something. And, the barrel roll is kind of an interesting and tragic part, because I'm no airplane.
It's an ancient meme, by the way, the barrel roll. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Right. Going back to Star Fox, but one of the pilots, or aviation expert, basically said that was perfectly done. It was skillfully done. No one would have expected that airplane to be able to do it. And afterwards, there's sort of this heartbreaking moment where he's talking to air traffic control, and they're like, "Wow, you did it." And he's like, "I thought that would be it." He thought that he was going to try the barrel roll, reach for that, and the wings would come off and he'd meet his demise. And I hadn't actually initially considered the comparison to Bushnell. So for context, this guy Aaron was I think he was an Air Force guy.
He was a reservist, I think he was, or he was legitimate. Yeah.
So, self-immolated outside of the Israeli embassy in protest to the genocide in Gaza. So I think there are sort of several things there that are different, right? One is, I don't want to say right coded, but the other, Bushnell's case, is very much kind of left-wing coded. And self-immolation, especially in the American context, the famous case is, that iconic image is immortalized both by just American culture and also on the,
Rage
Rage
Against
Against the Machine album, right? Is the Buddhist monk cannot remember his name, self-immolating himself in reaction to the South Vietnamese government's persecution of Buddhists. Brief aside, the history of Vietnam is quite complicated.
It's very
Carl
complicated.
Dahl spoke to Thomas on Mind Phaser about that recently. They've been doing a mini series. It is quite good, but as kind of the Spark Notes version, a succession of colonial administrations effectively put a sort of Catholic government in charge in Vietnam, was not very popular with the people. And so, the communist reaction to that, was it communist? Yes. Was it nationalist? Also, yes. And a large part of that as well is that the Catholic elites there were persecuting other religious groups, particularly Buddhists, hence this dramatic protest. And so this is sort of an echo of that. And I think that there's an interesting degree as well to which it is almost the echo of sort of the boomer protest generation, heard twice, reverberating first through the 90s and then second, more distant and faintly in, the 2020s.
Millennials,
right? Sort of like if you clap in a valley, you hear it echoed back a few times, each time fainter. And obviously, look, to say I don't support Israel is perhaps an understatement. I wouldn't necessarily have set myself on fire. But, it was sort of a dramatic moment, although it is almost interesting the degree to which, relatively speaking, he was sort of forgotten. Like you still see him every once in a while, but as someone who, quite infamously has infiltrated quite deep into lefty circles online, I like to see what they're talking about. His name comes up every once in a while, but not nearly as much as you'd think.
Not like Rich Russell on the right. Yeah.
100%. Yeah. Where Rich Russell, it's like almost you see him
every August. Every August. Yeah.
And you see a ton of his stuff, even in, like libertarian spheres, the more, authoritarian right wing for, using that. He's sort of transcended any specific tribe. And I think that there are several distinct differences. In Russell's case, obviously it is sort of a showy way to kill yourself in the grand scheme of things, but it is less performative, right? It is not necessarily to create a media spectacle.
It's not an activism per se. Yeah.
Right. It's an act of despair, not necessarily an act of, political radicalization. And also, I think, and maybe this is me stretching too much, but the radical outgroup focus of the airman who set himself on fire, right, which is I am aggrieved on the behalf of some other people, is fundamentally a different thing than I am personally aggrieved, right? Again, both of these things are wrong from a traditional Christian perspective. You should not do this. But I think that that's interesting because I had a very interesting conversation with someone who is explaining to me using the analogy of Freud's Thanatos and Eros, right? The life
nirvanic principle.
To discuss the different ways people conceptualize enmity, right? Conflict between groups. And this person, and I'm citing my source, but I don't want to say who they are because they're a private person. I'm going to bring them up. They said that the right wing, the death drive, operates on sort of a me versus you, right? Two parties mutually conflicting, right? It is them who are trying to get me. Yeah. And the left wing version of that is tripartite, right? There is a victim and victimizer, which you can read about in every IDW book, podcast, or speech for the last 10 years. And that's part of it, but it misses a vital piece of it. Part of the reason why conservatives perhaps don't understand leftists as much as they think. The third party in that is the hero, the advocate, right? Someone standing in between, the big man and the small man, right? Sort of casting themselves as an active role. And to me, that is what I see in this, right? The distinction between those two systems of aggrievement, if we're using that word, if that is a word, right? Where Bushnell is sort of inserting himself as the third party, right? Israel is oppressing the Palestinians. I am going to insert myself in between the two of them, set myself on fire. Whereas in the case of Russell, right, he feels, at least it seems as if he has been sort of dispossessed and aggrieved by wider society. And obviously, his reaction to that is to, do what he did. But do you see what I'm getting at there, Gio? The distinction between those two?
That is a valid distinction. The one thing I would push back, though, is I think that both of them have a level of existential anxiety and personal despair over this given situation.
Of course.
There's a great article, although I would hate to cite, because these people are usually they're leftoids or whatever. But there was a few great articles. One of them was by Columbia University Press, and one of them was by The Nation. The Nation actually did used to write very good quality articles back in like the 70s and 80s. But I'll read them in a little bit. But what I would say is that to sort of clear the air, there was, again, another very hideous person that was talking about this and how the right wing lionizes this loser Rich Russell, but they pour scorn on Aaron Bushnell. But although I would say at the time, I'm consistent in this. I think that the continual to sort of like critique the right for a moment online, I think the continual like belittling of Aaron Bushnell was sort of in poor form. And I think that there obviously is something, I mean, yes, there is this sort of leftist narrative of, a white guy feels like actually this is what this Columbia University Press article was talking about, how, a white man brings it upon himself to be an activist for, the Palestinians, for the third world, and so on and so forth. But I do think that the one thing that's very clear with Bushnell is that there is a confrontation with an impossibility of action. And I think that the reason it was existential for him, because of course he was an airman, he was in the U.S. military. And I think that even in his sunset note was a big impetus for why he did it, was because he felt like he was complicit in something that the U.S. government, really is. I disagree with the narrative for a lot of people on the left that it's like the U.S. is, the puppet master and they're doing this because of settler colonialism. There's other reasons which I won't get into. But I do think that if you are a U.S. serviceman and you do see what's going on in Palestine, I think it is a legitimate concern to be like, well, blood is I'm not directly, like, he wasn't running bomb missions over Gaza, but, in terms of the infrastructure of the American government and the American military giving support and aid to the IDF, I mean, that must have a huge existential weight on you if you believe in the cause. And
No, finish that thought.
No, I was just going to say, like, belittling him and degrading him. I think I understand it because the Palestinian thing has become left coded, at least. And although I would not say it in total. I think that, I'm going to piss people off by saying this. I think that the narrative that the Palestinian thing has become, definitely there is a lot of elements that are left coded, right? Like there is a lot of like third worldism, critiquing Western civilizations, this nation, Middle East being an extension of the West. But I do think that as a whole, that narrative has sort of been contrived for different ulterior purposes on the
advancement of certain powerful interests, shall we say?
To sort of excuse what's happening there and to say that there's not really something going on and it's brown third world coded. Like I think that there's more of a complexity to the issue. And I think that even if you're just strictly looking at it from like the interests of, say, the American people supporting a regime that's causing them a terrible optics issue, I think that's valid. Although I would be willing to make a moral argument to say that it's not just economic interests or geopolitical interests that are at stake. I think that the wholesale slaughter of these people and the complicity and the support of the U.S. government and these various interests involved I think that is, I would be willing to make a moral argument that it is a crime. And I think that Aaron Bushnell, because he was in these far left circles and because he was taken up as this martyr to then quickly be discarded by them, I think that it was a huge impetus for the online right to sort of seize the moment and say that, well, he's a whatever. But I think there is a level of performative cruelty in that, because the reality is that going right back to the thesis of, I forget who wrote the essay, Revolutionary Sunsetting, that was very powerful on the political left and Marxist groups for a long time in the 70s, from the 60s and 70s onwards. I do think there is a sense of confronting an impossibility with it. And there's a sense of a gravity there. And so I think that it was sort of in poor form to really go at this guy. I mean, obviously, the reality is with both cases, these were young men that were suffering very serious cases of mental illness. Their act of sunsetting, like you were saying, from especially a Christian perspective, is not noble in a sense. But I do think that to create a spectacle out of their despair for a variety of different causes does speak to something very deep and very unconscious in our nature that you were talking about with the Thanatoic principle. And some people debate the death drive of Freud, of course, but let's say for argument's sake it's valid. And so I think that to me, as someone who's looking at it intellectually rather than the sort of take economy or the meme economy, I think that there's definitely something there. And I wouldn't want to denigrate the seriousness of either cases of what they're fighting for. One, like you were saying, is very personal, very existential. Someone who lives a young white man who lives in the Western world who feels that his life has become impossible. The other one who feels that the geopolitical situation has become impossible and this monumental evil is being inflicted on the world that he is at least feels is part responsible for. But then I'll read that part from Columbia University. But go ahead, Bert. If you want to push back, then I understand. Yeah,
I think there's a distinction here, and you could, maybe this is over intellectualizing it, but you could almost say, to me, self-immolation, and not just because of its association with the Buddhist monk, like that sort of like ritualized suicide is very Eastern in a sense.
Oh yeah, right? That's
the
true.
idea of like, reacting in response to an ultimately fatal situation.
Yeah.
And obviously that exists in the Western tradition, primarily in the pre-Christian world, right? There were, the Stoic tradition, even before that, right? Even down to drinking the hemlock, right? Which was ultimately an act of, a great example as well. An act of kind of suicide in the face of, unsurmountable odds. But to me, it seems as if, and this is part of the reason, or at least I think part of the reason why the Christian tradition is so opposed to suicide in the ways that others are not, is that ultimately the Christian narrative is a comic one in the classical sense of that, right? So zooming out a little bit, right? You have the two masks, right? The tragicon and the tragicon. No, those are the same words. I said wrong twice. The tragic and the comic mask, right?
Right.
And,
right.
These have opposite arcs, right? One obviously ends in tragedy. A comedy traditionally ends in a marriage. You'll see that even in, modern comedies. And in the Christian context, right? The marriage is between Christ and his church, right? All things are made whole. That is the end, right? The telos, if you will. Whereas the pagan tradition is ultimately tragic, right? And there is nobility in tragedy, right? Don't get me wrong. But like, look even right at the idea of like of Ragnarok, right? Or the Norse idea of heaven as it is, right? Where it is still this kind of idea of, eternal suffering before all things dissolve. Eternal suffering is probably a little bit punitive, but you know what I mean? It is a struggle all the way through. And particularly as someone who's read a lot of Japanese literature, right, there is that strong sense of fatalism, And again, right, there are virtuous pagans. There is a noble reaction to the nihilism that comes from an ultimately futile struggle, right? You will fall. Weirdly enough, Berserk is a great example of this, right? The main character is damned and yet he fights on.
Well, I was going to say another right-wing figure is Yukio Mishima. I mean, that obviously comes to mind. Yeah.
Which, honestly, there's a good bit, like that might be an interesting third point of comparison.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You know, killing yourself is a political statement in reaction to a system you ultimately cannot mortally damage.
Yeah.
But my reason in bringing all this up is I think that, you know, when faced with ultimately insurmountable odds, there are sort of two reactions that come to mind. Obviously, there is the sort of, you know, allowing yourself to be mown over by the tank, right? Sort of leaning into, you know, your symbolic death. But also in Younger, there is the idea of the forest walker, right? And a man who is ultimately ultimately within history. You know, he is stuck within the system he is. And to a certain degree, he goes along with it. But he retains his own autonomy, right? He retains what makes him him in preparation for a time and place where he can become a partisan, right? Where he can escape from that system and strike back from a position of strength. And maybe, actually, definitely, this is slightly outside the scope of our conversation, but I think that is an interesting reaction to a ultimately, at least a currently futile situation. And I wonder as well as if that comes down to your assumptions about the finality of your life, in the sense that, like, is this all you have, or is there a reward or punishment after, which sort of affects your ideas about, I guess I've said suicide 100 times on this episode, so why not bother self-censoring?
Can I say suicide now?
Yeah, 100%, man.
Okay,
I had what we referred to in the business as a slip through on my last episode. There was a 3-letter term for a man who's light in the loafers that got through, and YouTube didn't notice it. It went live. I had to pull it down and put it back up. So they're maybe not as sensitive as they used to be. Sorry, Gio, that was a big
one time I interviewed ZHP. He did this bit where he had a voiceover of a cat screaming in the background. And you know where that's going, right? I did not notice he said the word. I totally butchered my views. I had to take the episode down and like re-edit it because he said it with his voice changer so subtly, which is, you know, the real H.P. Lovecraft's cat's name. And I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe I missed that. I'm so thorough with it, you know? Live streams, like DA, not so much, but like, yeah, like, I know what you mean, brother. Like, it's, but anyways. Yeah, Mishima is a great third bit because I think that Mishima was trying to achieve something, but in the face of the impossibility of the situation with the way the Japanese society had, you know, what it became, he said, okay, I'm going to go down the traditional route. And I think, like you were saying, there is a very Eastern sort of traditionalism to that.
With Mishima, who I was doing the math, I've read a lot more Mishima than I thought I had. And I like Mishima. I wouldn't consider myself an acolyte of his by any means. He's much more aligned with someone like Bowden than he is with me. We'll put it like that.
Yeah.
But point is, there is something as well in which the act of killing yourself has both a direct cultural resonance, right? That is a ritualized thing within Japanese society. I mean, even now it seems to be sort of a national pastime. But also it strikes at the values inherent to that system, right? If you are rebelling against a ultimately sort of consumerist, self-obsessed, hedonistic society, right? One that values, you know, sort of the new and shiny things brought from America, you know, that values the, you know, the kind of like ignoble pleasures that he is, you know, just excoriating in his books.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Cause you were saying like, no, I will, you know, end my life in an agonizing way in service to something greater than myself. And that strikes deeply at the, you know, the values of that system in a way that I'm not sure Bushnell's does, because we have several things there, right? Which is one, and again, I don't want to be punitive towards this guy. Obviously, it was a great tragedy, and what he is protesting is a great tragedy, right? So I don't want to be flippant here, but there is almost a grossness to it, which is the people he is protesting very clearly do not care at all.
I wouldn't say that though, because I think that Western leftists forgot Bushnell, but people there are like more like painted memorials, like that tradition of muraling in places like North Ireland and Palestine. I believe that in Palestine there were actually monumental murals painted of Bushnell. So
fair enough. I didn't.
But
know
Western
that. But
leftists, like, they're a bunch of traitors, and they're a bunch of like they betray their own people. They're not fundamentally not serious about the issue.
Well,
whereas I wouldn't want to see the Palestinian. Oh yeah, go ahead, Jay. Sorry, I'm sorry. Yeah.
The point I was making is like, I have to be careful here. I do not think the government he is protesting against has enough moral fiber to care about protests.
Oh God, no. I mean, come on. that's an obvious point. I mean, yeah.
You know, and I don't know. Maybe I'm too cynical on protest writ large. But actually, that's an interesting point as well. You bring up the connection to Ireland. Mm-hmm. I don't remember the name of the men, right? But the famous hunger strike as well.
Bobby
is another example of Bobby Sands, yeah. Which, I mean, Bobby Sands is sort of a modern, in the historical sense of the term, modern martyr, right? Yeah. And that's additionally, I would almost put in a different category, because technically it's the same thing, right?
Yeah.
The secession of your life. But one, all right, so as you guys are no doubt aware, I have been partnered with Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching for a long time. They're one of our oldest supporters. I recommend Axios because I use their product. I've been using Axios for almost 2 years now, and JD is a personal friend of mine. So if you're interested in diet advice, coaching, programming, whatever you want, head over to Axios and tell them Jay Burden sent you, because they support us. They help keep the lights on. And look, he's one of our guys. You should support him anyway. Thank you. And let's get on with the show. It's sort of more a negotiating tactic, right? Than it is. It's like holding yourself hostage, less so than sort of succumbing to despair, if that makes sense. So it is directionally the same, but sort of a different context, if you see what I'm getting at.
Yeah, well, with Bobby Sands, it was a political negotiation tactic, because if you look at the history of North Ireland, especially in the height of the Troubles in the 70s, 60s, 70s, they wanted to be recognized as what they were, which was political prisoners. And the crown, the position of the crown was that they are petty criminals, and that North Ireland is fundamentally the same as British society, and therefore that they were not entitled to the same negotiating rights, the same clothing, the same deference that political prisoners in an act of war were treated. They were treated as not even terrorists, but petty criminals. And I think that, so if you look at the rather horrendous conditions of smearing their own excrement on the walls and living in rags, it was terrible. No person would willingly live in that condition, but it was an act of sort of self-effacement for a greater political goal, which you could argue is on the right wing, which was equal to Mishima in terms of taking over that military barracks, but then he realized that he couldn't do it. And I think that's how the story goes. But it was a systemic process in the North, the IRA, and then Bobby Sands and another number of other ones. I mean, you have to realize that there were a lot of, even in the original Irish independence movement in the 19th century and then eventually in the 20s, there were a number of people that were martyred essentially politically by being executed by the British. That's why there was always arguments between the figureheads of the Irish independence movement. A lot of people, for example, accused De Valera of being a cuck because he had an American passport, and that's what saved him. And he's like, I'm going to fuck off to America, and I'm going to petition. Who was the president at the time? Was it Woodrow Wilson? No, it was it Wilson? Or
I'm the wrong person to ask.
Yeah, I forget who the president was at the time. I think it was Wilson. And so he petitioned the American government for money. And of course, with the huge Irish diaspora in America, they eventually did secure funds. But then a lot of people were sort of bitter in Ireland. I know this because my girlfriend's Irish, so I know some of this. A lot of people were bitter at De Valera for going to America and escaping the British bullet. And there was always interference being run by the British in these Ulster cavalry groups and so on and so forth. But yeah, by the time you get to the 70s, you do have this. I mean, hunger strikes are almost always inherently political in that sense, similar to the hunger strikes that happened at Abu Ghraib and Gitmo, because of the sort of rendition tactics of the Bush administration, then later the Obama administrations, which is very funny how, like, just as an aside burden, like, it's very funny how Obama was this leftist darling, but a lot of those people in Gitmo, they didn't receive fair trials under him either. I think, and listen, I'm totally 100% opposed to the Canadian government giving this guy millions of taxpayer dollars, because he did kill an American medic. He was a terrorist, right? But I do think that there's an argument to be made with Omar Khadr, for example, that he should have just received a trial right away. Like, it, you know what I mean? I think that
yes, like
he is a terrorist, though. Like, he is
and more humane way to deal out justice, and I'll leave it at that. And this is weird. This is a sidebar issue, but this is something that you and I spoke about in the as yet unreleased episode on your show, which is the way in which Obama honestly, ultimately cucked the left by giving them exactly what they wanted, right? The tall, dark, and handsome, very well spoken, sort of MLK2 figure. And then, underneath the wrapper, it was just Bush all over again. Right.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite, I'm Gen Z, I don't watch a lot of television, but one of my favorite shows, both because it's very well written and because it's sort of a time capsule of early 2000s America, is the original seasons of Arrested Development, right? And you don't have to be a genius to figure out that it's a spoof of the Bush family, right? The Bluths, George.
Wait,
Bluth.
Was it really?
Yeah. It's if you watch it again, it's not subtle, right? Like,
I never watched Arrested Development. Maybe I should.
It's quite funny. Like, it's genuinely incredibly well written. It's sort of the last genuinely funny thing progressives ever made, if that makes sense, where it is incredibly well written. But I mean, even down to the point where it's like the patriarch of the Bush family is implicated in sending weapons to Iraq, right? Where it's like, okay, they changed the details, but like, we know what you're saying, right?
Oh man. Yeah.
But the reason I brought that up is because there's there's commentary as well on kind of like Hollywood protest culture, right? Where the kind of like failed starlet, older sister in the family, goes to these, anti-war protests, goes to these these prison abolition protests. Yeah. And in the same way that we're talking about, Bushnell's death sort of being an echo of an echo of an echo, right? The sound bouncing back and forth in an alley. I don't know if you've seen, but in response to the alligator Alcatraz, right? So-called, liberals have started doing literally the exact same protest, which is they'd get like one of those like chicken wire dogs. Yeah. And lock themselves in it. And it's funny because even in the early 2000s, right, in this comedy show, that was a joke, right? Oh, like the progressives have locked themselves in a cage again. They're, doing what they do. And there is a degree to which, and this is sort of sad because it's almost like Bushnell's death was robbed of a certain amount of transcendence by being something we have seen over and over and over again in a way that Mishima's death was not, or that Russell's was not, because they were.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
But we're sort of seeing the echo of a dying culture, right? That the whatever you want to call it, like the boomer truth regime, the culture of the 60s, whatever. Bushnell's death, even then, is sort of an echo of that. It is made in that mold. And as that has sort of started to grow thin, right, it has sort of started to run out of its, life-giving force. Again, it's sort of an additional layer of tragedy to it, where it becomes simply another version of that, right? It's like, oh, that's just like this, which is just like this. And sort of like any one of these like copycat crimes, whether it be a copycat killer or a copycat suicide, right? The second time around, it's sort of robbed of its punch in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, it's a mistake to view the ending of someone's life primarily as social media content. But
of course. Yeah, that's I think what was so disgusting about it. Yeah.
Right. But as a deliberate act of protest, I think that's an additional layer of sadness to it, which is like you killed yourself. And for what? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's still going on. I guess you're not involved in it, so that's something. Your compatriots have forgotten you. Admittedly, the people there appreciate it, and that's certainly some reward.
Yeah.
But do you see what I'm getting at? Where there's almost an additional layer of tragedy to it, because it was sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy of futility. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Oh, definitely, 100%. Like I think that I don't want to be too cynical, but a lot of the protest movements, primarily on the political left, and actually to a degree on the political right as well. I mean, when they're not, it's very difficult though, because in terms of raw power, a lot of protest movements, especially organizing in real life on the political right, have been incredibly suppressed, have been suppressed by state and non-state, working with state actors, Antifa groups, so on and so forth. But I think that when it comes to the containment of people on the political left, obviously that sort of protest culture or the narrative about it that comes from the 60s social movements, and really even before, but primarily in the 60s civil rights movement and so on and so forth. I don't want to be too cynical, but a lot of it is an act of containment, in that protest becomes this very quick, very easy social release valve. And I think that the difference, though, is that in the internet age, we can see videos of what's happening. Whereas if you look at, for example, the second Intifada in 2002, there was a lot of chatter and speculation and so forth and protest on the internet. But in terms of social media, of course, the infrastructure was not there in the early 2000s the way it is now. And so you could see, children being beheaded by bombs. You can see people starving. You could see people, lining up for bread lines in Gaza and getting shot at by IDF soldiers. And then there's people that say that this isn't true, or this is like leftist propaganda, or what, and we debate whether it's actually being starved or not being starved. Like, it's cynical.
I got a fascinating email from Barry Weiss the other day. Highly recommend, by the way, subscribing to the Free Press. Don't pay the money. They don't need it, certainly.
But it's all Qatar, right? It's all.
It's magic. Qatar pays Barry Weiss, who is Amish, to write about the interests of a certain Mediterranean democracy for some reason. It's magic.
No, I thought Qatar was paying for the disinfo against.
Oh, you're right. You know what? I can't even keep it straight anymore. I think Qatar is just paying everyone. They're
it's
the
like
only
Russia.
people.
They just pay everybody.
Yeah, exactly. Qatar and China, or alternately Russia, are the only countries who have ever paid anyone to have any opinion. But in all seriousness, right? And actually, you know what? Let me pull this headline up on my phone, which I realize is very unprofessional podcasting, but I want to read it. I want to read it exactly, because it defies belief, right? The framing on this. Oh yeah. Here it is. From the Free Press, Monday the 18th. Poster children of Gaza's hunger crisis are actually suffering from other illnesses. So they're fine. They're just sick with other things. And the reason I bring that up is because, this is not a stream on Israel-Palestine. I wouldn't even consider myself necessarily an advocate for the Palestinians, but it is so clearly dishonest. And as someone who doesn't tend to have a lot of emotions about politics, like, it's just not in my personality, I look at this situation both as it affects our politics and others, and I understand the moral compunction many people feel, right? It is a grave moral injustice. Yeah. And especially, if you ultimately do have a nihilistic view of your life, right? It is I don't want to say good, but it is an understandable decision that he arrived at, right?
Mm-hmm.
In using that phrase again, within the bounded rationality of what he thinks, it is an option to move. And it is sort of, it is sort of interesting in a way, because one of the pronounced trends of the last 25 years has been a dramatic rise in isolation suicide, just generally speaking.
Oh, yes. Death is a despair as well, that it might as well be suicide. Yeah.
Exactly. It might be the same thing. And it is sort of interesting the way in which that is on one hand a trend, but this is sort of a wedding of that to like a belief in
a greater geopolitical, socio-political reality.
Yeah, which I think is an interesting flavor to this, and why it's not necessarily the same thing, right? Again, we're using this phrase over and over again. It's directionally the same, but motivated somewhat differently. But I sort of want to get back to Sky King.
Yeah.
Because, and I'll throw it to you actually, what do you think explains his continued relevance? I mean, obviously a certain amount of it is just that there's 15 minutes of the guy talking, right, that you can listen to. And so you, over the course of it, you do really start to empathize with him. Oh, yeah. But what do you think has sort of lent him this kind of meme status, I guess?
Yeah. Well, really quickly about the Barry Weiss headline, the question that you could ask would be, why are they dying of preventable diseases then? Are they not getting medical care? Like, and it's the same thing with like, they only like the Ben Shapiro, who's going on about how, you know, it's the only nation in the world that has to care about the crisis of war. And, you know, not that I support terrorism or anything, but like, it's not like people like they try to make this comparison with, you know, Ukraine and Russia. But the thing is, like, it's not as if they're like a totally autonomous nation. I think that's what people have to understand. And so when you control the means of life in a particular area, you know, whether you like it or not, they are your citizens. And so I think that, but anyways, let's not talk further in case, you know, YouTube, blah, blah, blah. Back to Sky King, although I will read something about Bushnell later on. But I think the continual fascination with Sky King, and a lot of, you know, there are cynical voices, even in the right wing, that are like, well, why are you idolizing this guy? You know, he ended it. But I do think that you have the marriage of spectacle, you have the marriage of DIY skill, and you have an intense voice of despair that is directly linked to your gender and your position in the world. And I think that's why Sky King, Rich Russell, became such a powerful symbol, because it was a way of, you know, protesting, rebelling against the conditions of the monotony of life without actually doing something that is a very moral gray area. And so therefore, if you are in the political right who is constantly having to avoid censorship and so on and so forth, for the first time, you can really look to a figure that tried to achieve a level of beauty and clarity and skill in his last moments without actually, you know, celebrating someone who is a terrorist or a dictator. Someone like Elliot Rodger, which people I think aren't really celebrating, but it's like an ironic sort of.
It wasn't like a subscribe to PewDiePie moment. You know, if you understand the reference. It's, and I think as well, it speaks to a feeling many have had, which is, it does feel as if, you know, my labor and my life is pointless, right? I'm sort of a human machine in a wider system that at best ignores me and at worst hates me.
Yeah.
And obviously I think part of this is driving the return of younger people to religion, right?
Yes.
It's something which can provide, to quote a deeply benzo addicted Canadian psychologist, right? An antidote to chaos. But
yeah,
not wrong. And absent of that, right? Well, to be honest, if there is no transcendent meaning, right? If there is nothing larger than yourself, if there is nothing to which your life is owed, then why not? Why not kill yourself? Yeah. Like, genuinely. It's like that, you know, that screenshot from Smiling Friends, right? The simplest argument against a nihilist is simply to kill him, right? Slightly more aggressively phrased, but it's the same thing, right? And obviously, it is good to speak out against that nihilism, right? That is the incorrect way to lead your life, and, you know, leads to self-destruction.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's a very real sense of empathy of like there, but for the grace of God, right? Like I think all of us, particularly those of us who look at modernity and find it objectionable, look at him and say, not that different than me, like I've been there.
Well, this is what someone that worked with him said. This is from, it wasn't the Seattle Times. It was The Stranger, Seattle's only newsletter, guest rant. This guy named Todd Bunker. I worked with Rich Russell at the Horizon Air, and I understand why he did it. So let me just read a little bit of excerpts from here. Day-to-day survival on the ramp, the area between the terminal and the taxiway where passengers are loaded and unloading, baggage is handled, planes fueled, etc., requires a lot of sacrifice to keep the planes moving. It would be difficult enough if adequate break room didn't always resemble a crowded sweatbox college party, but without any drugs or alcohol and nobody having fun. Brought your lunch to save spending $10 buying a meal in the terminal. Sure hope it's still in the fridge when you get your lunch break. Nasty emails directed to anonymous lunch bandits who were a common occurrence. There was a locker room, but not enough lockers for everybody. Think about how many layers are required to work in the weather in Seattle, and then think about where you would put your jacket, gloves, etc. when you don't need them without them getting stolen. If you don't have a locker, those things aren't luxuries. They're a basic part of work life. Going into a job, I knew that there was a sharp disconnect between the shiny, happy side of the terminal and the grit on the ground. When I didn't realize how much like a military base it was run, which makes sense historically, and which is why Horizon and other airlines recruit heavily from military bases. I went through initial training with a guy who had just spent 10 years in the Army. And so this is the end of the article. He says, this is to say, I understand what could drive a normal person to do what Rich Russell did. He saw his chance for relevance to be simply acknowledged as an individual human being and grabbed it. I don't condone it and wish it would have turned out. I wish it would have turned out with a spectacular landing that he could have walked away from as a folk hero to some, myself included. I'll leave it the questions of exactly how he did that to investigators. Rich's situation was not unusual for when he morphed into a wage slave economy. The fact that he had access to planes makes it sensational. There is plenty of people out there making not enough money, and they keep plugging along, not stealing multi-million-dollar aircraft and crashing them. But the next time you're at SeaTech, take the chance to look out at Horizon's gates from the main food court, and marvel at the controlled chaos on the ground. Off to your left, you'll see baggage tugs speeding to and from the catacombs under the terminal. Further out, Delta planes lurch largely. And when you step onto the stairway of your next flight, holding that Big Mac you bought at the terminal because otherwise there's no reasonably priced food on the plane, customers are now just numbers too. Remember that the person who flipped your burger is probably making $3 an hour, more than the person who handles your luggage, walks around the plane doing final inspections, and ultimately pushes the plane full of 76 souls, as we used to say, out to the overcrowded taxiway to send you off safely. Your life depends on the work that they do.
Well, and that's another interesting element brought up, right? Mm-hmm. The sort of reclaiming of agency, right? If you are that sort of cog in the machine, suicide is in a very dark way. It honestly, you know what this reminds me of? I have no mouth and I must scream,
mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it is that idea of like, the one thing I can do to rebel against, in that case, I don't remember what they're called, but the kind of like horrible AI overlord is to, seek the ending of your life. And it is dark. I mean, there's a reason that is, widely known as one of the most depressing, short stories out there. Right. But it is like, and this is not a point to talk about my readings of I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, but even there is a dark hope to it. Right. Which is I still have one option. I still can retain my autonomy by doing one thing. Mm-hmm. And again, within the bounded rationality, which I, do not share, there is a logic to it. I'll put it at that.
Right. Yeah. But notice how that the talk of Sky King is a personal expression of tragedy. Whereas I think I was actually trying to find academic papers on Rich Russell. I couldn't find them. But you could find a lot of academic papers on Aaron Bushnell. So let me read you an excerpt. This is from the Columbia Press. At the most direct, so on the cause of death, it's from Social Text Journal, which is run by Columbia University. On the cause of death, writing this feeling increasingly uncomfortable as it should is neither within my intention nor my reach to name Bushnell's suffering. Just I have no means either to fathom the suffering in Palestine, a fact that so much of North American activism avoids, with chants like the one that silenced me at the rally last month. In the millions and the billions, we are Palestinians. I can only seek to name the broader antisocial conditions delineating the question of what could possibly trouble someone understood to represent U.S. ideals inherent the spoils of its wars, indeed with whose reproduction presumably defines the raison d'etre of America's very existence as a nation state. Then it goes on to say, at the most direct scale, we might consider Bushnell's self-immolation as an expression of his explosive realization that the world he lived in cannot support life or ease death in the final analysis. At the same time, the ambivalence of his message delivered through the meditation of Palestine as a sign in conjunction with his own body as an object, again, very academic lingo, leaves dangerously open the potential to reproduce violence he explicitly intended to disrupt. That is the preservation of private citizens, refortification of the international rule of law and order, regimes of sovereignty they advocate for Gaza, but ultimately advance the project of Zionism. And while there's actually something to be said about that, which I'm not going to talk about, these properties composing the universe of white being, here, again, academic lingo, persists in the delimiting not only the literal detonation of Bushnell's message, but its subsequent metaphorical detonation by many of his supporters. And if it is true that Bushnell assumed the omnipotence of white ontology by default, or what Ruthie Gilmore calls emplotment, then this also means he operated with a collapsed sense of what other possibilities existed for him to become. In relation to the myriad breadth of socialities, the rest of us still struggle every day to remake, and not in a romantic movements of virtue, but in struggle with our own violence, the violence that each of us carries. In our own various capacities, we know that to bear witness to history is a privilege and severity we cannot accept lightly, and Bushnell served in this role through the end. If he was overburdened by the weight of it all, it must be because he was already holding too much, and there were no people or resources in his social society capable of abolishing the oppressions it creates. On this note, defending the honor of junior officer, retired U.S. Army Colonel and former diplomat Ann Wright, asked why derogatory commentaries framing Bushnell's death as a suicide have not come along public concern for the normalized phenomenon of suicide among U.S. war veterans discarded by the government after serving their time. Beyond the atomization of mental health, such are the basic circumstances of Bushnell's own freedom, a particular configuration of organized abandonment produced through the handshake rather than the heel of imperial democracy, delivered in the service of a genocidal political economy that connects us all through fatal antagonisms. That's actually a pretty good point, I got to say. I mean, it is leftist rhetoric, but like the sort of complicity with U.S. veterans supporting this terrible system, and at the same time being abandoned by said system that proclaimed to take care of them. I mean, goes back many, many years. This goes back to World War I. This goes back to the Vietnam War, so on and so forth. There, particularly this narrative of abandonment by the U.S. government and the troops that serve it. So I think that article was actually pretty good, although I would say that, was Bushnell consciously aware of the fact that as a white man that his message would carry forth? And sort of like the leftist ontology, I think that's obviously the message, that him being a white man gives himself more agency than any other protester. Although I think from other perspectives, that's not exactly true, because the sort of like, the BIPOC is lionized in the American media. And that's another thing too, is that when it comes to genuine political change, I know it's like a tepid, James Lindsay take, but there's a truth to it, the sense that the focus on the identity of the individual or the identity of the group is sort of like a way of neutering and de-radicalizing actual political change from Occupy Wall Street onwards. And even before, you could argue that the American Civil Rights Movement was a way of disrupting genuine political change on a global scale. And there's long histories of it. I think even people that you've interviewed, Bird, and talk about this as well, the sort of neutering and the complacency of the civil rights movement as opposed to genuine political change in terms of the greater power structure, as opposed to disrupting American and other Western societies' ways of life. So,
Yeah, I mean, that's the point that that Kaczynski makes in The System's Greatest Trick, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is it's 40 pages. You can find it on the internet for free. You should read it. Yeah, and I mean, I think that the point about identity, so this is very much a discussion for another day, because this is a topic I have a lot of thoughts on. But there is a degree to which the Lindsayite point about focus on identity is partially correct, in the sense that a splintering into obsession over, identity, over, kind of like sexual expression, is particularly useful for certain, shall we say, banking interests. I will also say that is applied to one half of the political spectrum and not the other. Perhaps leave it there. I mean, honestly, that's another part. And this is something you see on the very cynical kind of right-wing takes to Bushnell is exactly that point of like, oh, this white guy killed himself for non-white people who will, show him no gratitude. Where are the Palestinians killing themselves for XYZ pet issue? Which, I mean, there's
some of them have actually. There have been suicidal protests throughout the years, in Palestine.
And yeah, I mean, it is also depressing. This kind of goes.
No,
back
you know what
to
the thing is, Bern. I'll tell you right now. I'm sorry to interrupt, my friend, but let me tell you. I think the problem with the right wing online is that they're conflating Western leftists with like people in the third world. It's funny how like people in the third world actually did show Aaron Bushnell more gratitude than like bi-POC people in the coalition of the political left in Western countries, in particular in America. Like, because they're
very
like,
true.
even the very beginning, Bird, in the very beginning, you had people that were like, bi-POC, like, African American activists who are like, who's this white guy? Why should we all of a sudden care about this white guy? I support Palestine, but why should I care about a white guy? Whereas like actual Palestinians are like, I don't care if he's white. It's like, so I think like the problem is that in the take economy, there is a conflation. And by the way, the left, they have their own version of this as well, where they confuse their own like thoughts and feelings with what people actually think and feel and believe in the third world. Right? I mean, everybody does this, right? Like it's not like the sort of like Edward Said Orientalism isn't. Like,
I mean, this even goes back to my comments earlier about the Vietnam War, right? Where it's like, to what degree was the Vietnamese Communist Party like doctrinaire Marxist? It's like, well, okay, yeah, to some degree, right?
It was an ethno-nationalist movement, if anything else.
Yes, it was. I mean, it was basically, and honestly, much the same way that you could make the argument about the Chinese as well, but we'll skip that, right?
Oh yeah, like no, but Maoism always had an ethnic component. I mean, I don't want to speak out of turn. Like, there's obviously probably some Maoist scholar or tanky that would disagree with me, but I do think that, I mean, if you look at modern China, I mean, there's definitely an element of Han supremacism. I mean, in North Korea, Juche makes it even more explicit. But what you think that like the Vietnamese, like the neocons back in the 60s, like they thought that like the Vietnamese were going to side hand in hand with China? Like, come on, man. Like, that's like,
well, right.
Again,
and
weapons from them, but and they went to war with each other after. So
very true. Well, and that is.
So people like James Lindsay, they're half right, but they're also wrong, because Lindsay believes, not to pick on James, we always see, me and Bear, when we get together, we always inevitably pick on James Lindsay.
Which I will say, for context, we have a lot to go over on that. Again, maybe some other time, because this is recorded the day after our friend Oren McIntyre's appearance on Tucker, and it has produced one of the best meltdowns.
I haven't seen. I got to go to the Lindsay. He blocked me on Twitter, but I got to see it. Yeah,
he hasn't blocked me. I don't know why.
He responded to Mr. D. Telling him to go.
This is so off topic, but I do want to. I want to read something. This is the line he's going with. So far his line seems to be, Aaron McIntyre isn't white. So Aaron doesn't look white. He looks Sicilian, which is hilarious. Indian or Arab, who has changed his name to sound Anglo. So several things there. One, Space James Lindsay. The Sicilians, they're their own thing.
I kind of do look a bit like, listen, I'm half Calabrese and I do kind of look more white than Oren a little bit. No, Oren's white. Is it? What is he, like Scots Irish? What is he?
I don't know. I assume.
I gotta ask him. Yeah.
Yeah. It's the point is losing
there's
his
some
mind.
Black Britainer in there. There's got to be some Black.
Yeah. So, like there's a little bit of Mr. Bean in there,
Well, you're gonna go to the caucuses and say there aren't white James Lindsay? Come on, man. Like it's just there's some.
But he will go to Sicily.
That's funny. I love how James Lindsay is wading into the Nordicist controversy. He was saying Italians aren't white. Like that's crazy.
Well, it's like I say that, and like I'm joking because I think it's funny to say.
Someone's gonna like James Lindsay's gonna like go insane, like Jordan Peterson style, when some like troll, like someone like Nightmare Friend, is gonna make like a spinny whale Hyperborean edit of James Lindsay tweet saying like, Orange Brown. Like, oh my god.
Well, look, I mean, we're in the era where Gavin Newsom has been rehabilitated as the quote unquote savior of the white race. So who knows?
He like unintentionally retweeted a Grindr. Oh, that's funny. But but I was
finish that thought.
No, I was gonna say that it seems that there is like an ignorance both in like the Western left and even like people in the right wing. Like we were mentioning Vietnam, like obviously and there is like a right wing version of third worldism where it's like they're more based or blah blah blah. And I think like there's also like a right-wing version of like anti-third worldism that is also equally not the point. Like, especially when it comes to Russia, like there's people like Dugin and so forth that have a narrative that I think is not particularly apt. But then there's other people that are viciously against, Russia and do the whole like brown third world thing that I think like they're also missing the point. But it's very funny because when it comes to like the Western left, they also have this ignorance where they're like, socialists of the world unite. But when it comes to Vietnam, like, no, these people, like, they clearly were fighting for the interests of their own people. Same with China and Mao. And I think like there's a lot of very like, what's funny is that recently, although I think he's kind of stupid to do this because these people are insane. But do you know Flesh Simulator? He's a great YouTuber, but he's like a man on the left a little bit, and he's like got this anti-racism thing, but he was trying to argue with Tankies that China is actually severely racist, and it didn't go well because they don't want to admit that China is racist, but then China is racist. And so it's like,
have you ever met a Chinese person? Which I realize is a bizarre way to talk about racism.
Have
but you know what I mean?
Have you ever been to the West Bank? No, but it's true. Have you ever met a Chinese person from China, like that's a recent immigrant to China? Like we're full of them here in Canada. It's like, yes, they will tell you racist terms, and so it's like Flesh Simulator was correct. But so the way he's morally
just for an anecdote on that, we're combining two streams together of thought. I was one of my wife's friends in college who had, shall we say, a Southern Italian complexion, if you will, went to China to be a student teacher and got horribly, just maliciously mocked by these like 16-year-old Chinese kids when she was teaching there. And several funny comments, including, "Why don't you bleach your skin? Are you related to Rihanna? And why are you so fat?" Which,
oh my god!
To give her credit, she was not fat. She was like maybe 110 pounds. She just wasn't Chinese.
Yeah, it was a Chinese level of skinny. Yeah.
Where it's like, again, that's such an absurd premise at its core. And this is why, aside from anything else, and this has nothing to do with killing yourself, but I feel like really the transition that we're talking about, we're mentioning whatever this thing that feels like it's dying, is that the 20th century is very much the century of ideology. And we are thankfully moving into a non-ideological era because of very clearly all of these kind of comprehensive system of thoughts have so clearly run their course. At which point you have, again, right, people arguing about the non-racist, the anti-racist nature of the Chinese. And it's like, why do we let you read? Like, you should be like hoeing a field somewhere. This is a waste of tens of thousands of taxpayer dollars to teach you how to pass 4.
Yeah. Well, I would think that the problem with Flesh Simulator is that he's correct materially that the Chinese are racist, but I would say, like, okay, but who cares? Like, I mean, I think from his point of view, it's the sort of worship of the third world by Western leftists, which I think he's right on, that they are like, the third world is, I mean, first of all, the category third world is kind of like outdated, but I mean, the Chinese are incredible. They're not third world. I mean, they're second world or fifth world or whatever. Not fifth world, like third or second or fourth, like depending on the model, right? But it's like, the Chinese, they're incredibly racist. Okay, fine, who cares? But from the perspective of like Western leftists, it's like, I guess it's the same thing with like Dugonists who like worship the non-Western countries.
Gio, I think you've missed an angle on this. It is very important that the Chinese are seen to be racist, because in your country, being racist is a crime.
Yeah.
You wouldn't want to import criminals, of course. So maybe you can get the base libtard racism deportations. We'll storyboard this more.
But I don't know. It's the same thing with like saying like, well, like, like it's the other issue with. Anyways, go ahead, Bert. I was going to say something else.
No. I'm just saying we're gonna have to wrap up, because you can probably hear in my voice I'm a little bit under the weather, and I can tell my voice is starting to go. And since I do have to record later, I don't want to be sounding like RFK by the time we get to that.
Let me just read one last thing. This is from the Nation article.
Of course.
Yet even this perspective understates the complexity of our present moment. It's actually a pretty good article. I'd highly recommend reading it. Returning to Mark Fisher, the idea of speaking truth to power misunderstands how the space of belief operates in the age of capitalist realism. One defining feature of our age, he notes, is the quote, the overvaluing of belief, in the sense of intersubjective attitudes, at the expense of the beliefs we exhibit and externalize in our behavior. So long as we believe in our hearts that that capitalism is bad, that we are free to continue to participate in capitalist exchange. The same logic applies to Gaza. The ruling class can profess horror at Gaza while actively enabling it, precisely because acknowledgement and action have become uncoupled. It is now simply the power that can only speak to power. Rather, the claim to truth are often wielded to just the expressions of power that flagrantly contradict it. The big problem with Chomsky speaking to the powerless model is that it assumes the powerless need the truth revealed to them, when in reality they already know it, and they know the powerful know it too. So I think that's, I think even Zizek said that about you get the moral worth within the act of consumption by buying fucking fair trade coffee in Starbucks. It's like, the moral compass is right there. You just have to consume it, right? And I think they're doing that with the Palestinians as well. Like, if you buy enough Free Palestine totes, they will become free. It's not going to affect a single bomb being dropped.
It worked for Tibet, right? All those NPR libs bought the stickers and.
But then they realized Tibet is a racist theocracy. And so they peeled those
with like a
off.
terror god, like Buddhist, like syncretic religion, right?
Yeah. And so that wasn't like the California Eastland Institute PSYOP Buddhism. It was actual Buddhism in Tibet. So, we could talk about the Gaza thing, but again, I fear talking about the Gaza thing in public too much.
I do as well. I feel like there are many things you could speak about, but that is the one where I'll put it this way: due to Qatari influence, you can end up on a no-fly list pretty quickly. But Gio,
the thing the one last thing I'll say about Sky King is that I would also caution. This is hard for me to say because I actually did a number of artworks about Sky King back in the day, but I would caution with taking his message to heart to the extent that let me leave you with this. I truly, truly, from the bottom of my soul, wish that Rich Russell would have just landed that plane and he would have become a folk hero, because I think that the man was talented enough and he could have made something of himself. And I think that leaving his family was a mistake. The way I would say that Aaron Bushnell, I wish he wouldn't have done it. I wish that he would have contributed in more ways to the protest movement rather than because it was a disgusting video. It was terrible seeing that. He was screaming his lungs out till he couldn't anymore. And it was, but so I think like in both cases, their lives could have been so much more than just their final act. And so even someone who, I did our works dedicated to Rich Russell. I truly wish he would have landed the plane. I truly wish he would have become a writer or an activist or something. I think that the man had a beautiful, he truly did demonstrate something very beautiful in his final act. But at the same time, we have to realize that final act was in a sense needless, and he destroyed his family and people around him. I'm particularly give a shit about the airplane company or the fucking the people were making this argument like, oh, you destroyed $1 million piece of equipment. It's like, who cares? Who cares? That's all I'll say. I'm not condoning what these people have done, obviously. So yeah.
Well, definitely. Sorry, Gio, we've mentioned that you and I have some episodes coming out, so be sure to check out Gio. That's primarily on Substack, if I'm correct.
No, it's on YouTube, Substack, Patreon. I mean, the full versions are on patreon.com/Productions and substack.com/Geo's Content Corner. But we have an episode where we randomly talk about a lot of things, geopolitics and culture. And we have a very
some idiot forgot to finish House of Leaves after having basically 2 years to do it.
Yeah.
I did finish it. So we have 2 episodes, one which was supposed to be about House of Leaves and ended up being about Obama, and another one about House of Leaves, which I'm really excited for that to come out because I think that was a really good episode.
It was a great episode. It was an amazing episode. I have a number of other it's a whole series that I'm doing, bringing people on to record House of Leaves. I had a great episode with a podcaster, Jewel Discase. She's a great art podcaster. I think her podcast is called The Innocent X Project. Let me look this up. Actually, I don't want. Yes, The Innocent X on Patreon. Oh, there's a lot of free episodes. She's great. I believe she actually works in an art gallery herself. So we talk about that. I brought in the first episode I did was with Capitalissimo from the Sidebar podcast. We talked about the Walstow letters, which was at the end of House of Leaves. And then I have, I believe, another episode with Orkbrand, with you, and I want to bring on another person. So it's a whole series of people where I interview them about House of Leaves. So I'm content minded. So yeah.
This is just confirmed to me, Gio. I don't know how long it was since we'd talked before we did this kind of run of episodes. We need to talk more because we have very fun conversations. And I'm sorry that it went so long between speaking to you. Again, highly recommend Gio's work. You should check it out. As far as my stuff, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. Obviously, episodes early and ad-free. Patreon, subscribe to our Substack, all that. Again, Gio,
I quite enjoy the Apple Podcast feature. Yeah.
Yeah, it's nice. It's great.
Yeah, I was actually driving home from my GF. I was listening to a few Burden episodes. They're quite good. So there you go. I'm also an Apple Podcast as well. So yeah.
And everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.